And now, it's the Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law. Now, here's Sterling Fox.
Good morning and welcome to the Law Show here on CIL 650. Looking forward to this hour a great deal. We're going back to the subject of immigration law with the very capable assistance of Gordon Maynard and Alex Stojcevic, partners with Maynard, Kisher, Stojcevic, immigration and citizenship lawyers in Vancouver. Gordon and Alex, welcome back to the show. Good to see you both.
Good to see you too, Sterling.
We're going to talk. Nice to see you, Alex. We're going to talk about family law again on this program because we spent some time with your other partner, Rudy Kisher, was joining us on that one, and we talked fairly extensively about family law. But there is so much to cover. We really do need to spend a whole other program, or at least a good portion of a program, getting into some of the specifics of family law. And I think, Gordon, we've done this before. We've engaged you to burst a few popularly held and perhaps completely erroneous public myths. And one of them surrounding family law, held by probably more Canadians than not, is that if you have a family member living abroad and you're a Canadian citizen now, as long as that person is related to you, you can apply to have him or her brought to Canada. Full stop. How true is that?
Not entirely true at all.
Okay.
There are limited family members you can bring to Canada. You can bring your spouse or other partner, common law partner, conjugal partner. Those are interesting definitions of your partners that we'll talk about.
Okay.
You can bring your children if they're not adult children. They have to be below the age of majority, essentially.
Okay.
And you can bring your grandparents or your parents if they survive the process, which is going to be a lengthy process. That's it. You can't bring your sister.
Really?
Can't bring your siblings. No. Can't bring your cousin.
So who has this changed, Alex, over the years? Why do so many of us believe that all you need is to be related to somebody, and hey, you too can become a Canadian someday?
Well, the reason is because actually it was true at one point. I mean, you could in the 80s you could sponsor your siblings. In the early 90s you could sponsor parents, and along with the parents could come any unmarried sibling, regardless of age. So, you know, if you were sponsoring your parents, you could bring a brother or sister who was, say, in their mid-30s. But since about the mid to late 90s, that has not been the case any longer. And the grouping of family, the definition of family class in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act has gotten smaller and smaller till we have today, effectively, a relatively small group. Spouses, conjugal partners, children that you adopt overseas, and parents and grandparents, although there's some practical limitations to that, and that's about it.
Gordon, why did this happen? Why did they shrink the possibilities for family class immigrants? Were there abuses that were so prevalent that they had to do something?
No, I don't think that was the primary reason. I mean, there's always going to be abuses somewhere along the line, regardless of what category you're talking about.
Okay.
But I don't think that's the reason they made the changes. They made the changes because they wanted to focus on economic immigration. And economic immigrants, family members, aren't seen as economic immigrants.
Okay.
Although, you know, if you look at how they're redefining family class members, they really are making them more economic as possible. You know, so it used to be that family class members made up 60% of our immigration to Canada.
Okay.
Whether you're talking about direct family class sponsorship or having an assisted relative come as an economic immigrant. Mm-hmm. They got rid of those classes. They tightly redefined the family membership, and they made it tougher on sponsors. So because of all those changes now, family class immigration only makes up 40% of our immigration, maybe 30% of our immigration.
Trying to put a timeline on this, Alex, because as Gordon was talking about the shift in emphasis towards economic class immigrants, that smacks of the Mulrooney era to my memory. Is that about right? Was there a decided change in emphasis during the Mulrooney years?
It was the start of it, but it continued under the Liberals. There was almost that continued straight through the Chrétien-Martin times, and really the 60-40, where you lumped humanitarian categories all together. So family class, spouses, refugees as 40% and 60% being economic categories. And those categories were designed to somehow either enhance the labor market here or create an investment
Yes.
in Canada or
Sure.
start businesses in Canada. That continued under the Liberals. And the trend that has continued since the current Conservative government has come into power, if anything, is to emphasize that still further and maybe even move towards and not even maybe, I mean, the policy now is 70-30, and that's where they're heading. And that's not a shift that lacks controversy. I mean, there's a lot of, on the one hand, when you bring in a lot of particularly parents and grandparents, the challenge for the provinces, 25 years ago, you had a much younger population. The average age in BC was 35, not 45. And if you brought a certain number of elderly people, well, what was the real impact on healthcare costs and things like that? Potentially, it wasn't as big as it is today.
Okay.
Because we have an older population today,
True.
and so now you have a relatively scarce public resource, which is healthcare, and everyone's nervous about bringing in anything else that will add to it. At the same time, though, that was largely offset by the fact that a lot of successful immigrants became successful because they brought parents who would look after their children.
Sure, right.
And would provide free daycare, and contribute indirectly to the economy in that way. And to some extent, there's been an acceptance that is lost, and that loss from the policymakers' perspective is worthwhile compared to potential economic gain from bringing in other immigrants. Is that true? I don't know. But
and I think one more kind of overview that's important to keep in mind is, regardless of the shift between economic and family, the overall number of immigrants to Canada has maintained a pretty steady number between 200 and 250,000 a year.
So we're still taking in about 250,000 immigrants of all classes every year. And we've been doing that for quite a long time now.
Yes, we have. And so part of the focus on changing to an economic focus was making sure that you could still sell the immigration program politically at large. So that's something to keep in mind on this.
Okay, and just as a complete aside, you mentioned refugees very quickly there, Gordon. Has that number remained fairly constant despite all of the other changes to all of the other classes in immigration? Do we still accept approximately the same number of bona fide refugees year after year after year?
What has grossly changed with refugees is not necessarily in all. I mean, you can find years where we took the same number of refugees that we took this year, for example. What's changed is that most are selected now from overseas by the Canadian government directly versus becoming refugees through the internal Immigration and Refugee Board refugee protection program here in Canada.
People coming to Canada and making a claim in Canada.
That's the difference.
That's diminished.
Because a lot of the source countries that really were huge source countries for refugee claimants, Mexico, for example, now require visas, and until 2009 they didn't. And so, the minute in 2009 when they imposed visas, the numbers already started to fall of refugee intake.
Well, plus we use overseas interdiction to prevent people from coming to Canada with improper documentation.
Right,
we use safe third country rules. We use a lot of rules now to prevent to prevent refugees from coming to Canada to make claims. We don't want them. Well, the government doesn't want them to come to Canada.
And another very important aspect in the early parts of the 2000s, because the process was fairly slow to get refugees processed, it could often take 2 to 3 years. People got work permits in the meantime. So there was a certain percentage, I wouldn't say that it's a large one, but maybe 8 or 10% of the refugee intake was largely making refugee claims just so they could have access to these 2 and 3 year work permits. Now refugees cannot get work permits until they've been successfully found to be refugees by the board. So that incentive has been taken out of the system.
Interesting stuff. Now back to the family category of immigrants, and that's what we're going to spend most of our program talking about. The word sponsorship is axiomatic with any family class immigrant coming into Canada. One must be sponsored to come in as a family class immigrant. Is that the case? No exceptions?
Yep,
that's right.
You have to be. You can't say, "Listen, I'm trying to remember a person who would qualify. My son lives in Vancouver. I live in somewhere afar, and because he lives in Vancouver, I want to move to Vancouver and live with him. So here I go." That's not a family class immigrant, is it?
No.
Family class immigrant is by definition sponsored by a family class member in Canada who is a permanent resident or a Canadian
the
citizen.
son in Vancouver must apply to have me, his dad, come in from somewhere else.
Right, exactly. So let's take a look at that situation. So let's say it's your son sponsoring you. Let's say you live in Manchester or Glasgow or London or something like that, and not an uncommon situation in this city where we have that type of sponsorship.
Right.
Your son would have to show that he does not have an immediate criminal record in the last few years. He can't be in prison at the time that he applies as sponsor. He can't be an undischarged bankrupt under the Bankruptcy Insolvency Act. So in other words, he cannot be in the state of bankruptcy.
I
see. He can't have been on welfare in the last 12 months. He has to meet an income criteria to sponsor you, and that is typically a formula based on the low income cutoff figure, the minimum number that a person would need to live on in Vancouver for whatever size family he has. If it's 2, if it's 3, add you to it to make it 4 or 5,
and up the income.
Then increase it by 30%, and that's the formula that you need to meet.
Over 3 years.
Okay.
Over 3 years. And if you can show that he has 3 years of income that meets all of those criteria, then and only then is he eligible to sponsor you.
Okay. So so once the sponsor has to go through a series of hoops first before the government's even going to look at whoever it is that person might want to bring in.
And
Gordon.
let's emphasize that this is not about your size of your bank account. It's not about the assets you hold. If you have 3 houses in Vancouver, but only are declaring $30,000 a year in income, you're not going to be able to sponsor anybody. It doesn't matter what your net worth is. The only thing that matters is that your income that you're declaring meets all of these criteria.
Now, Gordon, Mr. Mythbuster, again, if I may, one of the perceptions is that a lot of people who were sponsored, who came to Canada, sponsored by family members, who signed some kind of undertaking with the government that as part of sponsoring this person to come to my country, I'm going to assume responsibility for his or her medical bills and well-being so that this person doesn't come in and become a burden on the state. And a lot of these undertakings, well, were reneged upon. So they had to change the rules. How that's a popularly held myth. How true is it?
It's true they changed the rules.
We know that part.
Well, that's not entirely fair. They didn't change the rules. They started to enforce the rules. I think that's the right way to put it.
Yeah, there have been issues with undertakings being breached, and what both the federal government and the provinces have done is taken a real interest in looking at sponsored immigrants and putting economic responsibility upon the sponsor during the term of their sponsorship.
Right.
So a classic situation is if you sponsor your parents and for whatever reason they're no longer in your home or you're no longer supporting them well, and they go and they try and get provincial welfare payments, or provincial support payments, I should say. The province will come back to them and say, no, you can't. And that's enforcement now. That's enforcement of the undertaking. You're under a term of undertaking. That undertaking is quite long now.
10 years.
Okay.
Under the old rules, and then the changes from 2013, it is now 20 years.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay.
So the province will look at that and say, no, we want the sponsor to be responsible under the undertaking. Or if you're looking at MSP coverage, and any sort of subsidized health care that's beyond the pale, the province will look at you and say, we want the sponsor to cover that. We want to recoup that from the sponsor.
Absolutely.
Now, we should be clear. All immigrants have a right to MSP. So that anything that's tied directly to medical coverage, you're entitled to regardless of the undertaking or not.
Okay.
Where there is an issue are things that say, let's take your example, your son has sponsored you, you come to Canada.
Right.
You're entitled to Medicare the same way as anyone else would be. You're entitled to a subsidized bus pass for someone your age, all the seniors discounts that you would get from any other organization.
What a presumptuous guy he is. Look at
Well,
me and guessing my age. All right, I'm kidding.
What you would not be entitled to are things that a Canadian or a permanent resident would be entitled to if they were living here. That were not sponsored. For example, you would not be entitled to subsidized housing through BC Housing because of your age. That you would not be eligible for.
Right.
You wouldn't be entitled to subsidies for assisted living unless it was coming out of the province's medical budget. Okay, so unless you had a catastrophic injury or something that occurred here,
sure, right.
and they funded your assisted living through the Ministry of Health directly, as opposed to a disability that would be funded by the province, that would not be, you would not be eligible for that. And that's an important distinction between permanent residents and that are sponsored versus ones that are not sponsored.
Has there ever been a case in which a person was brought into Canada, sponsored, all the forms signed up and whatnot, and then the sponsor simply abandoned the file? Not only did they not assume any financial responsibility, they just walked away. So now what happens to that person who has come to Canada in good faith? Are they sent home?
No, not necessarily. No, they're not. You'd have to find them inadmissible for some reason, but they could go after the sponsor for breach of undertaking.
And these days they do.
Okay. But the person in the meantime now kind of stuck in legal limbo because nobody's footing the bills as was promised before they came in from the old country. So now here they are in this new environment, kind of, out of luck.
If the provincial ministry takes the position that the sponsor refuses to live by their undertaking, they will put the family on welfare. Okay, they will put the elderly parents, allow them welfare, allow them a living allowance like anyone else. The difference between them and anyone else in this situation is they will then take legal action against the sponsor.
Right, to recover their costs.
It's to recover their costs.
Sure.
It's a crown debt. You can't declare bankruptcy to get out of it a lot of the time. Sometimes you can, often you cannot. They will garnish wages. They will go after property. They will enforce with the federal government so that documents like passports and driver's licenses aren't issued. They'll garnish tax returns that you have, any kind of GST payments. The province and the feds are quite coordinated in this and have become quite aggressive because they really want to discourage breaches of these undertakings.
So as a result of all this, breaches have diminished.
Completely.
Right. Well, understandably.
Yeah. But I think the situation that is more common is not so much breach by the sponsor, but an inability to, for instance, we talked earlier before going on air about the spouse in Canada who is waiting for sponsorship to get processed.
Right.
And during that time wants to be brought into the provincial health care system as a spouse of the Canadian citizen.
Sure.
And that's a difficulty because the processing time hasn't advanced to the stage where the province is willing to recognize it. And so this gets to be a processing issue.
All right, and that's where we need to take a break because, boy, if you think things are just complicated as they are, based on the first few minutes of this conversation with our guests from MKS Law, Maynard Kisher Stojcevic, well, just wait until we find out how much time people are now forced to stand or wait, at least, in line before somebody even bothers to look at their file, let alone call them by name and actually have an interview. This is The Law Show on CIL 650, and we're just getting started. Lots more ahead. Back after this.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CIL 650.